welcome to the Guard Tower. My name is Tony Garcia, and to my right is
Danny, how's it going?
good, Danny. Yourself?
Doing well, doing well.
Hey, Danny. One of the things I want to talk about today is, and I think that this is a pretty important topic, and let me give the explanation on it. I want to talk about the hidden expectation that the general public would have of security personnel during a situation. And let me set this up for you. If you have a heart attack at the courthouse, they call you to come assist with this medical issue. What does the general public think you're going to do?
Oh, see, when you first stated the question, I thought you were asking me if I had a heart attack at the courthouse. And I was going to say that actually, that there's been a time or two where like I felt like that was going to happen, but that was more of like a blood pressure combined with, blood sugar issue. But no, I'm good. I'm good to go. So so we are expected to respond something that drastic, like somebody who's possibly like, going code blue. Like we would actually have the I almost said EMT training, not EMT training, the EKG training to help with that. So we would respond, but we have to keep. So what's interesting about a court building, we have to keep people screening downstairs, even if there's an emergency going on upstairs, because people are coming in, and you can't have random people coming in with dangerous items just because you're dealing with something upstairs. And so we may send, 2 people upstairs, make sure we have at least 2 or 3 people downstairs, and fire gets called right away. We share radios with the PD, so we can actually call fire from our radio if we need, and they'll respond, but we're waiting with the person. And so for us, there's an expectation that we can help at least until fire gets there.
Right.
Yeah.
But when you arrive and you're still waiting for fire,
Mm-hmm.
and you see the general public watching you as you arrive, what do you think they want you to do?
Yeah, I think they want you to behave as if you're a first responder, right? So
And what does that mean? Behave as a first responder.
So
remember, you're in an official-looking uniform.
Yeah.
You are
Very official.
working for the court.
Yeah.
Somebody's dying. Their brother, their father, whatever it is. What do you think that family member is expecting you to do?
I think they're expecting us to do, excuse me, I think they're expecting us to do CPR. I think they're expecting us to use the EKG, to contact, fire, medical, contact PD. I think they have a lot of expectations of a single person.
That's what I'm talking about. The hidden expectation that people have of security during a situation. You also work for contract security, right?
Yeah.
So let's take that into another perspective, right? You're working at a construction site. You see somebody fall off the ladder. They've broken a leg. Mm-hmm. What do you think people expect you to do at that time?
Well, unfortunately, the reputation that our construction site guys have developed, they expect almost nothing out of us, and that's not a good thing on that sense. So I'm talking specifically about our guys that we have doing those construction sites. So there is very little expectation, but I think there, in that specific scenario, they would expect us to at least be contacting the authorities to make sure somebody was responding.
But I find that ironic too, because if it's me with the broken leg, and you're the security officer, and all you're doing is calling the cops or rolling fire or doing whatever you have to
911. Yep.
I'm still looking at you to do what?
To help you. You want some help.
In any form or fashion, whether it's give me a bottle of water, whether it's, hey, you're going to be okay.
Yep.
But what you're saying, though, is the expectation would be the actual performance of the job would be pretty limited.
In that specific scenario, only because they're so used to there being a construction guard around, that they pretty much only see you as like an observer, and that probably changes going across the board. So at other types of construction contracts, there may be the higher expectation. Now, when I was a field supervisor for that same entity, the expectation was completely opposite. It was way higher, and that's because we're driving around in the trucks. They've got the pseudo flashers on them, like the yellow ones, and we're armed, and we've got the whole monkey suit on. And so, yeah, if we showed up somewhere as a field supervisor and something was going on, then they expected us to behave like law enforcement, which again was an unrealistic expectation, but it's one that we were used to dealing with. Yeah.
I also teach my classes this: if you're a security officer at the mall and somebody's stealing from Zales, and you see this guy running towards you, guy or girl running towards you, and the Zales manager's yelling at you, "Stop that guy! Stop that guy!" His hidden expectation is for you to do what?
Tackle him.
Right?
Clothesline.
I mean, that's what you're there for. Correct? I mean, am I wrong with that assumption?
No, that's definitely. I think that's definitely how most people see uniform security, especially if you're wearing. And it seems so silly because it's just an object, right? It seems like a dumb thing, but if you're wearing a badge, then some people don't even know the difference between a well-dressed uniformed security officer and a police officer. So I've heard arguments where people are actually trying to get it downgraded for security officers to where they have to look more casual and less professional because of people's expectations when they see them.
Oh, yeah. You know what, Danny?
Yeah.
It's so funny that you bring that up because that's another topic that we could be discussing in another show. The difference between a security officer and a security guard, but we'll leave that to a different show.
SEO, yeah.
But let's go back to the hidden expectations. You also brought up armed security, right? I think the hidden expectations for unarmed security officer are high from the general public during a situation.
Yeah.
Could you imagine the expectations for an armed guard? Let's just say you're the same officer at the mall, and there is a shooting at the mall. I see you run away as the unarmed guard. And I'm not saying you, all right? I'm not saying you. Don't
But
say
if
that.
I'm unarmed, I am running away.
Right. But then at the same time, people expect you to do certain things.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I would feel, I've been training security officers for over 30 years. I would say that there are small expectations that I would expect from the security officers. I would expect them to lead people out. I would expect them to maybe hide, but then hide with people. I would expect them to make phone calls. So those are little expectations that I have. And don't get me wrong, I would never condone that an unarmed officer go out and try to stop the active shooter. But if you're armed and you're hiding in a closet with me at the mall, my expectation would be to, hey, dude, you got a gun. If you're not going to go, I'll go.
Give me your gun.
Yeah. I mean, how would you feel if the officer was hiding out with your family in the mall?
So I've heard two mindsets on this. I'm sure there's more than that, but the two primary, if the armed guard is hiding out with my family in the mall, he better be protecting my family
To the utmost.
with his gun.
With just sitting there like this.
Yeah.
I got this family
Right?
covered.
He's got to have that door covered. He's got to have, some kind of perimeter figured out. I mean, that's the expectation, but I don't expect him to run in, although that would be helpful.
But on the flip side, though, if he's protecting your family and my family's in the mall, my expectation is for him to go protect my family.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I get it because I used to be a high school teacher. There's always talk about whether you should arm teachers or not because
Arm them, all of them.
well, see, that's where we differ. That's where we differ, and I'll tell you why. It's the same concept of what we're tracking down right now. If I'm an armed teacher, right? Do you want me to be reactive, or do you want me to be? I'm sorry. Do you want me to be defensive, or do you want me to be offensive during a shooting? Which one would you prefer?
If my kid's in the class, defensive. Um, if there's multiple teachers that are armed, I think they need to figure out who's going to be offensive. Or if they have armed security there, the armed
Well,
security can be offensive.
and I'm glad that you say that because
Yeah.
as a teacher, I don't want to be armed
Hmm.
because then I have to make that decision.
Yeah.
Do I stay defensive, meaning I'm behind this door and I'm protecting my 30 plus students?
Hmm.
Meanwhile, the shooter's still going out there. Now, I taught high school seniors. The minute I become offensive, what do you think my 30 plus seniors are doing?
Panicking.
No, those fools would probably, and I'm talking to you fools, they would probably run outside with me.
Oh, okay. So you're
Thinking
talking
that-
about the hard chargers. Okay.
Oh,
I
yeah.
gotcha.
I had nothing but hard chargers on my class. I taught a law enforcement program, so what does that tell you?
Nice. I'm glad they're still okay.
Um,
They're out there.
But at the same time, when I go become offensive, I've just left my class alone.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm that parent, I'm going to be like, no, you should have stayed with them.
Yeah.
The way I see a person that should be armed on campus is the security personnel. They should be armed. They're the ones who are going to be mobile. They should not be locked away in a classroom. They should be able to respond to anything that they got. The problem with school security, though, is that they're treated not so well because people have a low expectation of a school security officer, or I'm going to say school security guard, which we'll talk about another topic, guard versus officer,
Yeah.
in another episode. But what I mean by that is most school districts really don't train. They don't train their security personnel. They're just there as a body to walk around campus. Now, if you were to ask me, my whole point of school security would be to hire personnel who could be armed and respond to a situation. Is that a lot of training? Yes.
Yeah.
Is that going to be a lot of responsibility on just this person? Yes. But let's face it, when it comes to school security, you're going to see a lot of a lot of guards out there just riding around on their golf carts, not able to respond to an active shooter situation, which is actually counterproductive of what we're trying to do in today's society. And I get it. We might have one armed officer on a campus. A school might be lucky to have one armed officer. But let's face it, one person going against a shooter, would you rather have one or would you rather have two? Meaning an armed security officer that the police officer knows is trained,
Yeah.
can handle themselves in a situation. I know that I would always want to be taking another person with me, whether it's another police officer or whether it's another security officer. As long as there's armed, two guns versus one.
Yeah, that becomes, from the PD side, that becomes a little controversial as well, because I have talked to patrol guys in PD who they don't want the armed officer getting in the way or causing some kind of like extra situation that they have to worry about. So in a weird way, some of them, their mindset is, I want to be able to focus on the bad guy, and that's it. I don't want to have to worry about this guy who isn't part of my police force. You know, I don't know how he was trained. I don't know if he's gun shy, trigger happy. I don't know any of those things. So unfortunately, I think some people disagree with that, because I agree with you. I think that there's more safety in numbers and having more well-trained armed people. But I think, so on the flip side, if the PD from that area, if they know that those guys are squared away,
Are well trained.
are well trained, then they may feel differently about
Sure.
approaching that way. Yeah.
And it's funny too because I come from a different viewpoint when it comes to school security and police officers and all that other stuff. I really feel that we could train a school district security personnel to the same level as a police officer. You know what it takes?
Yeah.
Time and money.
Money. Yeah.
That's all it's going to take, because I have the lesson plans from the local sheriff's office, right?
Mm-hmm.
I volunteered for the sheriff's office locally here for 15 years. I've been through their same level of training. Could I train a security officer the same way? Of course I could. What I've learned, though, and this is going to sound kind of off topic, but a little controversial. What I have learned though is that PDs kind of have that attitude, right? And it's not so much that they don't think that they're well trained. I really feel that most PDs are looking at it as, well, they're going to replace our jobs. Meaning, my gosh, why are we going to send an armed police officer on campus? Which to me is actually a waste of resources for people, right? That officer should be on the street, right? But if you have 3 armed security officers at a school, right? Let that officer respond to the call when it happens, and you have 3 people well trained, equipped to handle what? And I would also make sure that they also have some type of uniform that is easily recognizable by the PD when they show up.
So that goes back to the overly casual debate that some people are still leaning towards having us dress down so that we don't appear like law enforcement. But that becomes a problem because then at some point you just look like a random dude with a gun, or even just a professionally dressed guy. But if you don't look like you're in uniform, then you run the potential of they don't know who the active shooter is. So if PD comes in and then they see a person, even if they're well dressed, they see a person with a gun, you may end up in the line of fire because they need to be able to identify you. So
sure,
I mean, it's the same issue that guys have overseas as well, right? It's identification.
Well, to me, it's just that all you got to do is build in a second hesitation. If I'm a responding officer and I see another guy wearing a badge, I think you mentioned earlier, when they're wearing a badge, people think that, oh my gosh, that's law enforcement. If I see a badge on another person, I'm going to be like, oh.
Pause.
Until I see, well, then this person doesn't belong here.
Yeah.
Because let's just face it, that's what they're ingrained to look at. But it's just funny, like I say, the hidden expectation that people would have. Could you imagine being an armed security officer during an active shooter situation on a school?
Yeah.
I mean, the hidden expectation that I would have as a parent.
Huge.
Oh my gosh, I'd be like, no, you need to go in there.
Yeah.
And then I'm back to you. And it all depends on how they're dressed, what they're designed to do. But let's also talk about the hidden expectation that we have of the police officers working. All right. I bring up in 2022, 2 Tempe police officers did not jump into a lake to save a drowning man. My hidden expectation would be for those 2 officers to do what?
Jump in and help them.
If I'm standing there, that's what I'm thinking that these guys have to do. But at the end of the day, I also know that they don't have to respond to that call, or they have to respond to the call, but they actually don't have to jump in there to save him. Right? That's not what they were trained to do. And future news articles have stated that the Tempe Police Association has said that they're not trained in water rescue. And then I actually look at the reality of what they had to face. Do I expect the officer to jump in there with his duty belt on? Probably not, because once he hits that water, what happens with the duty belt? It becomes weighted, right?
Yeah,
that's
the whole uniform soaks up, becomes
that,
a weight.
That's a lot of weight, right? If I'm working with you and I say, hey, Danny, I'm jumping in, I'm going to get this guy, right?
Yeah.
You got to hold my belt,
right?
Or we both jump in, and then we both leave our belts on the ground. Some bystander walks by and takes our belt while we're trying to help this guy. So that's what I'm talking about, the hidden expectation that people have of not just security, but law enforcement as well. So that's what I think that that's what we're facing as security personnel when we're working. I think clients have to understand what we're capable of doing, what we're capable of not doing. I think that once that's spelled out, right, especially when it goes back to what we were talking about being armed security and what is actually expected from the client.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I had a senior moment just now. So.
Did you guys? I mean, it's everywhere. You'll even see it in that Chicago dash cam, Chicago PD, I believe. And there's just this shootout right in front of the Chicago PD, and the officer just drives away. You can see it on the dash.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, she's like, no, I'll respond to this when it gets called in. drives off.
When was this?
I don't know, last year sometime.
Okay.
But there's a lot of examples of just, if we look at different videos of just that, like the police officers not responding as you would assume they would. And even, what was that phone call from Portland? I believe it was Portland, Oregon, where the young lady was calling dispatch for assistance, and dispatch was like, "We have nobody to send to you," and giving her advice, right?
Yeah.
While her ex-boyfriend's trying to break into her apartment. So it's like, okay, well, I guess I don't have so much expectations.
There
Right.
was a news story recently that came out that I forget which city it was that actually reported this, but they were saying that between the hours of like 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. that they only have enough staff to have like 20 officers. And,
Good. But you know what though, Danny? Like the way I see it is, fine. You don't have enough officers. Well, then hire security. See, in my world, security outnumbers law enforcement already.
yeah.
At least 5-1 across America. Security needs to be able to take a better approach to a lot of situations. If we're going to be relying on law enforcement to handle every situation, it can't happen. They can't hire enough cops quick enough. They can't get through the process quick enough. But if you have a well-trained security force who could handle certain calls, then I think that we'd be better off as a society because we have multiple responders. It's so funny because I volunteered for the sheriff's office as a posse member for 15 years. We dressed just like the sheriff's office.
Yeah.
Nobody knew the difference. But you know what, though? We outnumbered, I think, regular law enforcement 3-1.
Oh wow.
Yeah, 3-1. But then the new sheriff came in. He didn't want them. He doesn't want them because he didn't think that they were trained enough. We weren't capable of handling that. But all you did was just reduce the number of officers that the general public perceives.
Yeah.
Like it's crazy. It was actually crazy. So, but I think security can take away a lot of things from law enforcement. I really do. School security, court security. No offense, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean,
absolutely.
as long as they're well trained and receive a decent pay. I mean, I wouldn't want to work at a school for $18 an hour.
No, and I actually have a coworker who she came from corrections and she came from high school security, and so she had done both. And according to her, the high school security was almost worse than than corrections, just in the amount of stuff they had to deal with, but also because since you have the stigma of the environment where, at least with corrections, it's like, who you're dealing with, your audience. With high school kids, you have the parents involved, you have the staff involved, and there's all these layers of mitigation, I guess, that you have to deal with.
So I guess I'll ask this to you both. What about the liability there? So, I mean, what authority does security have, which is not much when it comes to law enforcement, right? Law enforcement has this.
Well, it's funny that you talk about liability. This is how I teach my classes too. At the end of the day, the hidden expectation is going to be up to the responding officer. It's going to be up to that person. If that person wants to do CPR, they're going to do CPR. I've been in situations where I've seen people foaming at the mouth. I'm not doing CPR, right? So let's get that into focus. It's going to be ending up on what that individual person wants to respond to, and how they're going to handle the situation. But when it comes to liability, a lot of it really is that, and how much enforcement a security officer has. It's funny when we talk about liability. A lot of it's going to be depending on the contract company, how much they are willing to take on themselves, what they expect from the officer at that time, because it is a great point, because it's possible that the company says you're not doing anything, and the minute that person decides to actually help out with that medical situation, that company can let that person go quick, like no issues, no worries, because they violated company policy. But it's funny when you say how much liability and how much are you talking legal authority? Because it's funny when it comes to security and the way it has always been portrayed across. Most people believe that security can just observe and report. That's all they're meant to do. But that is not true. I'll give you guys the perfect example. School security. We've been talking about school security and the expectations of there. You guys, a school security officer can get into a student's locker pretty easy. They don't need probable cause, right? If a responding officer shows up and the principal wants them to get in the locker, or the cop just wants to get into a locker, is that going to be allowable? Well, I take that back. The principal can tell them to get in the locker, then that would be legal. But if the police officer just wants to open up the locker, is that a legal search?
Right. It can become, for them, they can become legally liable because of their
Fourth Amendment.
their process. Yeah.
Right. The way it's all going to be worked out. Meanwhile, the school security guard can just get in there and do what? Open up the locker because they're actually part of the school district, right?
Yeah, so going back to what Isaac said, though, so if the teacher decides to sue the school or the security officer or guard because they open invasion of privacy or whatever, and they tried to go the legal route, then I think that's where people's minds go when they're thinking of their private liability in that process. Is
Correct. That's with a lot of this it would have to go through the court system at some point. I mean, we've talked about it earlier.
Oh, sure.
About California changing their laws because they saw that security guards were outnumbering police, right? And so that's where shopkeepers laws come into place. I mean, I would assume that would be the same case with schools. At some point, the legal system's got to catch up.
Oh, yeah. No. But once again, it would be back to the hidden expectation of what we would want a security officer to do. And it's funny, too, because I tell people, too, that, the security field really started off as a respectable industry. And I'll give you the example. Pinkerton Security, one of the oldest security companies.
I was about to say Pinkerton, yeah.
Pinkerton, one of the oldest security companies in the world, started off by taking care of the president. They took care of the railroads. It used to be that if the Pinkerton men were coming after, Pinkerton men or women coming after you.
I think back then it was just men.
Well,
I'm just kidding.
Man, it was a big deal. They were going to come to get you. They actually started the Secret Service. I mean, if that doesn't show you that the power that a security company had at one time, then something's wrong. You're not easily impressed by anything then at that point. But now in today's world, that most people think security can't do anything. That is not true. They can actually enforce a lot of laws on private property. It's just whether the client wants them to be allowed to do that, number one. And number two, whether the company wants to take on the liability of what they got. But if you're going to be expected to handcuff people, right, you better give that officer a lot of what? Training.
Yeah.
And hopefully more money, because now they're going hands-on with people who could possibly be arrested or detained, depending on how well you want to look at it. But once again, depending on what we got going on, the officer might not want to do that.
Yeah.
So
I've even had coworkers who had been patrol officers for PD for close to a decade, then medical retired, gone into private security, and then told me while we were in private security working together, I don't want to be armed because of the liability of it. And that blew my mind at the time hearing that, because I'm like, but you spent how many years armed on patrol? Like, doesn't that make you feel more capable of dealing with a situation, or at least being able to protect yourself or the people with you if something happens? And his final conclusion was just, I don't want the liability. I was like, well, I disagree with you, but I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, I get it, because a lot of contract security companies, if you were to get in a shooting, they could probably let you go within 2 hours. You violated company policy, you violated procedure. Meanwhile, you're going to be like, I never saw a use of force policy. What policy did I violate? I had to defend myself. Well, then
Yeah.
you just won't have anything to fall back on. So I get what he would be saying, which is actually kind of scary at the same time.
It is a little bit. Yeah.
It's scary.
So to that, it's also like when I got out of the military, being a medic. I mean, I knew way more than the paramedics there. You know what I mean? And that's just a liability.
Right.
Do I want to take that on? But I mean, there's another variable other than liability. There's public perception.
Oh yeah, yeah. Which goes back to the expectations that people would have of security. What do they really expect you to do, and how to handle a situation? It's almost scary on how everything could play out, and what you would be designed to do as that security personnel assigned to that assignment. Like I say, it's funny that a lot of people would want an unarmed officer to respond to an active shooter because that's what they think that they're going to do. It's just not going to happen. That person is unarmed.
Yeah.
But once again, I would go back to, I would expect them to lock doors. I would expect them to get people out, direct them which way to go. If somebody needs help and it's safe for them to do so, I would expect them to do that.
Yeah.
Little things like that. But as far as...
Well, I mean, it might swing a little bit to the political side, and I hope it doesn't. But when I say public perception, I'm also looking at when people post things that security officers do where they should do, right? Let's say they stop a crime that's occurring. There are people rooting for the person committing the crime. So they can turn and twist the company, you know, because
Sure.
the security officer represents that company and make that company look bad.
Right, right.
I think that's unfortunately that becomes more of like a cultural abnormality, right? Coming from perceiving a bad guy as a good guy. That's a whole other
Whole nother
issue
topic,
for sure.
yeah.
Oh yeah, no, like I say, we can run the gauntlet on this thing. It's unbelievable. But I just felt that it was pretty important for us to talk about that concept before we go on any further into our shows, depending on that way we can set everything up. I really feel the expectations that the general public have of security is, I don't know the word, it's exceptional, I guess is the best word to look at it. And then, like I say, let's go back to your courts. Depending on how you're dressed, depending on what you look like,
Yeah.
a person will never know that you're just a security officer. Don't take offense at that.
No, not
and
at all.
make sure your department doesn't take offense to that, because I'm pretty sure you guys are wearing all blue.
So it's more like a gray, but we have the patches and insignia of our of our department.
Oh yeah, no.
Yeah.
I'm looking at you right there, going, "No, that's a cop. That's a cop.
Yeah.
He needs to do something."
And we're very clear to, if somebody says something like that and brings it up, we're clear to specify, like, I am not an officer, right? I'm not a police officer. Like, this is what we do, this is who we are. So the messaging's clear verbally, but visually it's
Oh yeah,
it's
no.
different.
The message there verbally during a situation is,
Yeah.
you're gonna do something, and I get it. Even security officers have to identify themselves as, I'm just a security officer or a security guard. I don't have any law enforcement, depending on what they're looking like and depending on what they're doing. But at the same time, if I'm one of those civilians out there and I run to you for help, I'm going to look at you like, what good were you today?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We actually ran into that internally right after we did a training scenario, and everyone was involved, the staff, everyone, right? So it was on a weekend day basically, so there were no customers in the area, but we did a active shooter scenario. Patrol guys got to respond in order to practice their method, but what we had to do was just receive the initial fire, and then the bad guy took one of our scanner badges and boop boop boop, right, made his way in. But what we were asked afterwards is, didn't you guys do anything? The staff asked us this, and we were like, well, that wasn't our scenario. we weren't supposed to do anything in that. In real life, it had actually happened. I would like to think that we would have responded a little differently, but there is an expectation, even from people who know us well and talk to us every day and know us by name. And they asked us what, and we're like, well, that was a PD scenario. They were training their guys.
They think that you're going to assist them when they arrive. And PD's just going to kick you guys to the curb. Not even thinking that you guys can handle a situation.
Step aside, please. Yeah.
But once again, it also goes back to the situation. A lockdown, right? Say you got somebody running across the parking lot with an AR. You go into lockdown, right? Even if that person starts approaching the doors, the people expect you to not let this person in the building, right?
Yeah.
Especially civilians. That's how I would be looking at it. I'd be like, dude, you better lock that door. That guy's coming this way with that AR, right? Meanwhile, we're going to have security officers or security guards do what? Run away. Run away. And I would be like, no, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Like, you have to lock that door. You're supposed to protect me, especially in a more official looking uniform. Like it's incredible. So, and it's funny because I would have those expectations, and I've been doing this for, like I said, 30 plus years, especially when it comes to my kids. If you're not willing to protect my daughter, right, then you should have never been in that job. You should have never taken that role at that time. And even though when it's all over and said and done with, I'm going to be like, no, they were just supposed to observe and report. But I'm making sure that my daughter's taken care of. Like, I want them to be safe. So
yeah,
it's pretty different. It's pretty different.
I know the same argument's been made for churches more recently, and a lot of the bigger churches that can afford it will have armed security and stuff, but the smaller ones, like the one that I attend, like they're probably not going to have someone on payroll that's just doing armed security. So there are those of us who are in attendance who have already talked to each other, agreed with each other, hey, we're the first responders here, as far as if something happens in the specific
you have a
congregation.
volunteer force. You have a volunteer force.
Right.
Yeah.
But having, there being a trained, group of people who are actually assigned to have that responsibility is much more useful than just anticipating, okay, how long is it going to take for, PD to get here, fire to get here, or, and like you said, just that expectation of, what's going to happen in that emergency, that situation.
Well, it's funny too, because I think we talked about it earlier today, liability. I'm hoping that your church is willing to cover you guys as volunteers in case something were to happen. Because the liability that you'd be encountering, you're just a regular civilian at this time. You miss your shots and hit 3 bystanders.
Right.
Who's going to get sued?
Yeah.
You are. So I'm hoping that the church is willing to say, no, we blessed off on it. Nah, it's funny. Blessed off. We blessed off on this team. So it's going to fall under our insurance. But they've also taken this training, and this training in order to minimize the liability that you guys would be facing as a volunteer force. That, to me, that would be a big issue. And then it also goes back to, if I'm a member of that church and I know that there's armed people running around here, my expectation would be for you guys to do what?
To respond.
Once again, if you're hiding with me in a closet and you're armed and you don't do anything, Danny, I'm taking your gun, and when I'm done, I'll hand it back to you.
I think it also separates between the type of church, right? So a smaller church, you're serving, right? That's one of those things that you would assume is serving, and so you're trying to protect the flock. So that expectation is pretty high. Those mega churches, though, they can afford PD for the weekend.
Off duty, yeah.
That's what one of the mega churches do. They work with Gilbert.
Sure, but even then, you have one person, and I'm going to be honest, that police officer is not going to be carrying an AR-15. Right. That shooter, more or less, is going to be using multiple weapons. Your responding officer has one pistol. So that's why I always believe in having more people show up to the call. You can have your armed officer running around, and I think that's actually good. I would still have armed personnel in regular clothes. That way nobody knows how many people you're going to be defending this area with. And train with that PD officer. Have them talk to the officer and say, hey, what do you think about this? Hey, what do we do with this? Hey, these are the kind of things I'm going to do in order, if a shooter happened, this is how you're going to identify me. It almost runs, it's crazy, the paths you have to take during that whole training. But I would still say, if I'm the responding officer, I want more guns. The more the merrier. And I'm still waiting for my officers to respond in 3 to 5 minutes. That 3 to 5 minutes, what's that shooter doing? We don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole object of an armed person during a violent encounter is to actually mitigate the number of wounded personnel during that time. That shooter's actually always going to be ahead of the ball game. It's how much we want to mitigate when we're done. So.
Yeah, and unfortunately for the good guys, if there's a really efficient bad guy who, like, he knows what his objective is, 3 to 5 minutes is plenty of time to do a ton of damage, right? It take a lot of people out, and that's unfortunate for us.
But let's tie back that, and let's wrap up this episode. It goes back to that hidden expectation. People have to realize, though, that it doesn't matter what's going on. The expectation that people have of security or police officers, even the time, people expect that once you dial 911, there's going to be a response within 30 seconds. It doesn't happen that way. Just running through lights doesn't really happen in the real world. They have to wait for stoplights. They got to make sure that the intersection is clear for anybody to get through. So I think we should end there. I think we should be able to say the hidden expectation that people have of security personnel is pretty high. I think we have to say that thank you for all the armed security officers out there, and thank you for all the unarmed security officers out there who work every day and are willing to meet that hidden expectation that people have of them. So,
amen.
Yep. Have a good one, guys.
Thanks, Tony.